When we talk about big data today, the tension often at the heart of the debate is that between security, or public health, on the one hand, and privacy on the other. The idea being that we are willing to give up part of our privacy in order to have greater security. For example, in those countries where they are already using COVID apps with the possibility to track and trace people with the virus so that others can see if they have been in contact with them. In countries where these apps are already being used, the idea is, well, you give up a bit of your privacy in order to be more secure and to have information about the virus so that you can avoid it as an individual and that the public as a whole may be healthier. So we sacrifice privacy for the sake of security. All of this while, in some situations, of course not all, elected officials have some kind of centralized power over this temporary measure. And the idea is that our sacrifice of our privacy is also a temporary solution to this problem. Now, where it comes to the big companies that Zuboff discusses, the tension seems to be more between transparency and privacy. This way is at least one of the ways in which the Google economists are phrasing it. So the idea is, and think back of that quote from earlier, that look, if you don't do anything bad, you have nothing to hide. It is not a problem that your actions are transparent to the watchers. The watchers in this case being not so much states as those big companies, GAFAM, that we have discussed. So we give up some of our privacy in order for these companies to have transparency, to have insight into our behaviors, so that they can actually make our lives more convenient. Because they have all these data about us, they can predict what search results we want to see, what places we want to go, what advertisements we may be interested in, etc. Zuboff, of course, has a slightly more cynical take. And this is again from that article I recommended to you, Big Other. She writes, in the world implied by variance, that's again that Google economist, by variance assumptions, habitats inside and outside the human body are saturated with data and produce opportunities for observation, interpretation, communication, influence, prediction, and ultimately modification of the totality of action. This is, of course, that nudging that you hear so much about these days. Unlike the centralized power of mass society, there is no escape from Big Other. And Big Other, the title of her article, is the word she uses for the conglomerate of these big companies, the watchers, right, that have so much insight into our lives, the watched. There is no place to be where the other is not. Linking that to today's situation, here are two excerpts from a New York Times article, which I put on Canvas as well. It sort of gives you an overview of the current state of affairs where it comes to tracking apps. In South Korea, the Times reports, government agencies are harnessing surveillance camera footage, smartphone location data, and credit card purchase records to help trace the recent movements of coronavirus patients and establish virus transmission chains. In Lombardy, Italy, the authorities are analyzing location data transmitted by citizens' mobile phones to determine how many people are obeying a government lockdown order and the typical distances they move every day. About 40% are moving around too much, an official recently said. So here again, we have, of course, states who demand a sacrifice of privacy for the sake of security, for the sake of health. The worry here, and you know this no doubt from the current debate in the Netherlands as well, the worry is how much privacy do we sacrifice for the sake of security? Where do we strike the right balance? Now, as Zuboff said in that previous quote, her concern is that it's kind of already too late. The genie is out of the bottle. That is to say, already companies have so much information about us that perhaps Zuboff would say about today's discussion of the COVID app, that it's behind the times. Like, sure, we may have these concerns about state-regulated apps, but what about these companies that already have all this information about us, that already track us all the time? Now, of course, The title of Zuboff's article, Big Other, is a reference to Big Brother from the phrase, Big Brother is watching you. At some point in high school, you may have read George Orwell's 1984, the dystopian novel written in 1948, predicting a future where a totalitarian regime knows everything about you in your public and your private life. There is no escape from this totalitarian state, from Big Brother, who is both a symbol and a totalitarian leader, watching you wherever you go. Here's another quote from Hal Varian, the Google chief economist. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Everyone will expect to be tracked and monitored, since the advantages in terms of convenience, safety, and services will be so great, continuous monitoring will be the norm. So this is a prediction Hal Varian makes, and again it harkens back to that earlier point I made about the seeming inevitability. This is unstoppable. People expect to be monitored, so resistance is futile. That's very much the atmosphere breathed by this kind of quotes. I put a picture next to it of The Social Contract by Rousseau. Now, whether you've read political philosophy before or not doesn't matter. You've no doubt heard at some point about social contracts, the idea that we as citizens of a particular state give up particular freedoms in order to receive in return particular rights and protections. So the idea that we give up part of our freedom, part of perhaps even our privacy in exchange for some kind of protection, security, and particular rights and privileges, this is a very old idea. What is new, according to Zuboff, is Google's attitude where this contract is not actually signed on to, but simply assumed. By using Google for a search, it is assumed that you enter into a contract with Google. You use them to search the internet. They provide a service. The service is seemingly free, as in you do not pay money for it, but it isn't free because in return, Google gets information about you. And the implication here is that by using a Google search engine, you are thereby voluntarily entering into a contract. Nothing wrong with that, according to this Google worldview. A contract implies, therefore, a certain reciprocity. I do something and then you do something for me in return. A question surrounding contracts of this dubious nature, as Google proposes them, right, where by simply using Google you enter into a contract of sorts. The central issue here is consent. Do you in fact consent to Google also using you in some way? Now there's a multitude of problems here that we could discuss. I'm just picking out a few. Most notably the fact that Zuboff points to, namely that asymmetry between the watchers and the watched. We don't know exactly what information the watchers are gleaning about us. You could find out more, and some of us are more knowledgeable about this, but most of us, out of convenience, perhaps out of laziness, or simply because you don't have the time or the energy to look into this kind of thing, we don't know what we're actually consenting to. What information exactly is being gleaned from my behavior? And again, what Zuboff is pointing to here is the long history Google has of simply taking information, right, the Google Street View model, without asking permission, sort of hoping that, well, by the time regulation catches up, it's far too late to do anything about the huge stores of data that Google has. Here's a definition of privacy, and of course there's many, but this is one that works well for our current conversation, by the US Supreme Court Justice Douglas. It's very old, from 1967. He defined privacy as follows. It involves the choice of the individual to disclose or to reveal what he believes, what he thinks, what he possesses. Now, could be she, presumably, as well, but that's the basic idea, that you have a choice in disclosing and revealing your beliefs, your thoughts, your possessions. Now, what are some of the problems that come up when we think about this notion of privacy in combination with the big data debate that I discussed earlier? Zuboff phrases these questions in terms of what she calls the division of learning. Again, that division between the watchers and the watched. So one question is, okay, who learns from global data flows? What do they learn and how? Who participates and how? Who decides who participates? And who has privacy and who does not? Finally, very importantly, what happens when authority fails? So in the division of learning, we again have this division between, well, most of us who are being watched, and then the watchers. The watchers, we can point to who they are, we can point to these big companies, but who are they exactly, and what do they actually glean from all these data flows? We know very little about the workings of these companies because, as opposed to states, as opposed to, well, many states, of course, not all of them, these are not elected officials, these are not people who are accountable to the public in any way to disclose exactly what they are doing. Again, there are ever new laws and regulations that try to get more transparency into the workings of these companies, but they are, after all, companies. They are not democratically elected governments and so cannot be held accountable in the same way. Now, who participates? Well, according to many by now, internet access is actually a human right. So if it is a human right to, officially or not, to have internet access, that makes all of us participants in this space where there are dominant players watching us. So who decides who participates? Well, perhaps if we see internet access as a human right, then governments will take it on as a responsibility to give people this access. But once they are online, what happens with the information people share there? And again, that issue of consent. What do we actually consent to when we enter into that space? So who has privacy and who does not? There's an important asymmetry here because whereas we as individuals who go online, who use Google, use Facebook, etc., have very little privacy and data is basically gleaned from our behaviors, the companies, right, the watchers have great privacy in what they do with this data, how they accumulate it. They may have a slogan that says "Do no evil," but what does that mean? What happens when authority fails? Well, of course, according to Zuboff, it already has. Who is the authority here? It's not even clear anymore who actually has the authority, who should have the authority, because again, of this model that many of these big companies use, where they just colonize, right? They use that imperial method of taking things that seem unowned, right, that seem like waste, like the tiny behavioral data that nobody seems to care about, and package them up, sell them, use them in some ways without permission. But again, who should they ask permission from when the very issue of authority is unclear?